Welcome in, listener. You're listening to a segment from the Slumpbuster podcast with Ju-Ju Dre. Find the full episode on Spotify, iTunes, the Google Play Store, or our YouTube channel. Enjoy.
Let's not forget what happened this past Saturday. Khabib, a mess of a last name that I'm not even going to try to pronounce, destroyed Dustin Poirier this week to basically move his undefeated streak to 28-0. This means that he has the third longest undefeated streak to start a career. The only ones that exceed him is Luis Rafael Laurentino at 31 wins and Julio Cesar Neves Jr. at 30 wins. Neither of those two guys have competed in the UFC either, by the way. So Khabib, he's really put himself at the top of the pack right now. So kind of like break down Khabib's fight for me.
Yeah, so Khabib, he always has, and it's Nurmagomedov, right? So try to say that 5 times fast, Ju-Ju.
Nurmagomedov.
You're telling me you don't speak Russian?
I think to assume I did would be Russian to conclusions there.
Too many dad jokes, Ju-Ju. Too many dad jokes. But no, so Khabib, he's always got the same game plan. I think this is part of what makes him so good. Is the dude's been training right since he was really young. So to give you a little bit of background on Khabib, and I'm actually disappointed that more people don't respect what he's been through and sort of what he is. I think a lot of it is, in some ways, he was sort of made the bad guy in the Conor McGregor fight, jump in the cage and all of that. And so for anybody that doesn't have background, there was a lot of contention between Conor's camp and Khabib's camp. And some stuff was said. It made Khabib very upset, and he jumped over the cage, right, and attacked one of Conor's training partners, coaches. And so I think a lot of people see Khabib as a bad guy, though I really don't think so. And so if you look at his background and where he's coming from, it actually makes sense why that would happen. So Khabib, he grew up in a part of Russia where, it's almost off limits to foreign travelers just because it's so dangerous. So there's a lot of terrorism that comes out of there and major world events, right, that can be scary and it is very dangerous to foreigners. So that's where he sort of grew up. He's been training in martial arts pretty much his whole life. He's wrestled bears, literally bears with, a muzzle on them, right? As one of his training partners when he's like 7 or 8 years old or something like that. And he still actually does wrestle with bears. He's done all kinds of Sambo competitions. So Sambo is definitely one of the more intense martial arts that you can do outside of MMA and boxing. So that's a lot of submissions. It's almost an MMA style fight, right? There is some striking with some throws and submissions, sort of a mix of kickboxing, judo, and a little bit of Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And so Khabib, though, when it comes to his style, he's just a fantastic wrestler. He has the same game plan every single time. He, strikes fairly well. He leaves his chin a little bit open, but once he gets his hands on you, he's going to take you down to the ground, and he's either going to punch your face in or he's probably going to choke you.
Yeah, speaking of his ability to choke you, submit you, what he did in that fight against Poirier where he slipped the guillotine and somehow managed to turn it into a rear naked choke against the cage there, that's impressive. That tells you that, this kind of grappling skills that this guy has.
Yeah, no, definitely. So he's by far one of the best MMA wrestlers, I should say, right? So there's some guys that come from a wrestling background and they compete in the Olympics and all that, but sometimes it doesn't always translate very well. So there's guys that could have been very good high school wrestlers, very good college wrestlers, or just very good, Olympic athlete level wrestlers, world championship wrestlers. But it doesn't always translate very well just because when you add in the striking dynamic, right? And a lot of times you have to change your fighting stance. So when you wrestle, you put your dominant foot forward, right? So for me, I'm right-handed. I use the right side of my body. I kick with my right foot. So in wrestling, I put my right foot forward. Whereas in fighting, it's the opposite. You put your power behind you, right? So that you can get a little bit more wind up, more turn with your hips when you're hitting and kicking. And so now you're leading with your left foot. And for a lot of guys, it seems like it's only a small thing, but that's a big transition. Not only that, but with wrestling, you want to be bent forward a little bit more, have a lower center of gravity, right? So you can shoot effectively and drive through your shots. Whereas in fighting, obviously, you don't want to be bent down because that's how you get kneed in the face or uppercutted and stuff like that. And so it's a hard transition for some guys to make, but Khabib, I think by far has some of the best, if not the best in the world when it comes to MMA type of wrestling.
Well, to contextualize kind of Khabib's dominance too, he's only lost 1 round in his 12 UFC fights, and that was in the Conor McGregor fight. And if I remember right, that was a little bit even contentious that he lost that round. And then to add to that, the guy's never been knocked down or cut in a fight. Like, to go this long into a MMA or UFC career specifically without having any of those two things as a stain on your resume, that's insane. No one goes really undefeated in the UFC too. It's kind of like insane to be able to maintain this level of dominance.
Yeah, absolutely. It's unheard of and very unprecedented, right? So the only other guy that is somewhat comparable is Jon Jones, which I think we'll get into here in a little bit. But to be that dominant in MMA, and the thing that makes MMA so different from some of these other fighting sports, right, is the other fighting sports, they're one-dimensional. So in Taekwondo, kicks are coming at you, right? And that's what it is. That's what they do is they're kicking. In wrestling, a lot of it is just takedowns or defense to takedowns. And so if you can defend their takedowns or you can counter their takedown defense, you can win it. In boxing, all you're looking for is punches. MMA, though, you can lose a fight 3 different ways.
To even add to that, when you talk about like just wrestling in terms, you can even like scale that down even more too. If you go into like a Greco versus a traditional versus style, like you can like really piece by piece those. And there's all kinds of different like specialty acts in all these certain disciplines too. Whereas you're right, in a UFC game, you have to bring it all together into one. Like you mentioned how great of a grappler like Khabib is. He's managed to overcome that. And I've even heard some people say he's not even the greatest striker in the world. And he did get popped in that fight against Poirier, especially in the first round. And you could tell that stung him. But he just bounces back like so well, like so much better than a lot of other fighters.
Yeah, and that's the thing is a lot of times the reason why it's so hard to be undefeated as well. So one, I said there's a lot of ways, right, that you can sort of lose the fight. You could be submitted, you could lose by a decision, or you could be knocked out. And a lot of times what you end up seeing in MMA is that there's this weird sort of triangle of people that can beat other people, but they'll lose to another person. So one of the best examples of this is Ronda Rousey, Miesha Tate, and Holly Holm, right? So Ronda Rousey can beat pretty much every woman, including Miesha Tate, and that's because she's found a way to counter Miesha Tate's wrestling using her judo, right? So every time Miesha Tate would take a shot, she would use judo to counter it, use sort of the momentum against her. Foot sweeps, all of that stuff, and she could beat Miesha Tate probably 9 out of 10 times. If you want to expand it, you could even say 99 out of 100 times. Whereas Holly Holm, though, could beat Ronda Rousey because her striking was so much superior and she was so long that she could keep Ronda Rousey from getting her hands on her. And Holly Holm, obviously would knock out Ronda Rousey. And I think if you were to redo that fight over and over again, Holly Holm would still be the winner just because she was such a superior striker. And then Miesha Tate, though, can beat Holly Holm probably almost every single time just because Holly Holm doesn't have the takedown defense. And so when it comes to Khabib, you would expect, right, that over time somebody would figure that out and figure out, hey, here's the weakness in his game, which is, can I keep his hands off me pretty much? Can I stay away from the fence so that he's not, pushing me up and crowding me into the corner or up against the cage where he can, land some vicious elbows or some dirty boxing strikes? Or can I keep him off my legs so he doesn't take me down? And you would think that there would be somebody that is, athletic enough, a good enough striker, and long enough to be able to avoid that. But we just haven't really seen that with Khabib.
With that said, do you think Khabib is the best pound-for-pound fighter right now in the UFC? Do you think where's his place right now on the historical rankings?
Yeah, so when it comes to historical rankings, I definitely have him up there. One of the guys that I had really high up there, obviously, was Daniel Cormier. It's hard to argue for him now that he's lost his last fight, right? So he has to definitely take a step back. And he's lost before, obviously, to Jon Jones. Jon Jones is also up there, though for me, and this is just me personally, I find it difficult to rank a guy that high that has done steroids, right? So he's been popped, and maybe he was not popped necessarily for steroids himself, though he did get popped for T-ball, but he's been popped twice for banned substances. And a lot of people still give him the benefit of the doubt, and they say, hey, it was a tainted substance, or, he took some pills, right, because he'd said that he was having some fertility issues or something like that. And to me, I don't know if I believe those, especially twice. Like, fool me once, shame on you, but fool me twice, shame on me type of thing. So I find it hard to rank Jon Jones that high up there. But Khabib, I definitely think you have to give it to him. There's really nobody else that has gone undefeated for this long, right? He still has not lost a fight, and he's been that dominant. Even guys, right, like Anderson Silva was not that dominant. George St. Pierre was very good, but even he had lost a few times, and and been knocked out. And so Khabib, honestly, if he can continue this, I can see him going down as the greatest of all time. Some of the issues, though, when it comes to Khabib is, especially early in his career, there was not a lot of guys that were high level that wanted to fight him. And so there was literally guys turning down fights with Khabib because I get it. They don't want to lose, they don't want to lose a fight, especially if you're next in line for a championship. Why would you want to fight Khabib? But even since he's become champion, right, there hasn't been as many high-level competitors that you would hope to see Khabib fight. And I think that's out of Khabib's hand. I think he wants to fight those guys, but he doesn't always get the chance. And then the other thing is Khabib hasn't gone up another weight class. And that's where Daniel Poirier, I think, does get a few points, right, is he's won both at the light heavyweight outside of John Jones, and he went up to heavyweight, cleared out the division except for Stipe Miocic.
I guess that's a fair point, too, when you consider best pound for pound. That would also imply that you're fighting at multiple weight classes. Now, it'd be interesting. So a big thing that could also shake the scales in terms of Khabib's legacy is this fight that has never really happened. So Tony Ferguson was the first one to want to call out Khabib as soon as the results of that fight went through. He jumped on there. He had an ESPN interview with Ariel Helwani, and he had some interesting quotes in there. At the top of the list, sign on that dotted line, and you'll get a good old-fashioned American ass whooping. Now, Tony Ferguson, this guy's no scrub. He has a 12-fight winning streak going back all the way to 2012. Kind of disappointed he only has 12 fights in that time, but we could talk about that a little later. He's 15-1 right now in the UFC, and yeah, he's just has a perfect style to really kind of combat Khabib, according to all the experts. So what do you think needs to happen to make this fight happen? Because it seems like they're a bit snake bitten. And if you don't know the backstory, too, this fight has been scheduled 4 separate times, but has fell through each of those times. In 2015, Khabib had to withdraw due to rib injury. 2016, Ferguson had to withdraw due to fluid buildup in his lungs. 2017, Khabib had to be taken to the hospital because he was cutting weight and it caused issues with his kidneys. And then last year, 2018, and this is the most ridiculous of them all, Tony Ferguson tore ligaments in his knee, turning sharply to greet fans at a media event. So, 5th time's a charm?
Yeah, so I really hope so. So I've been waiting for this fight for a really long time. Obviously, we said, dating back to 2015, right? And we're now almost into 2020. And I really hope that we see this. One, for Tony Ferguson, I think he's earned a legitimate title shot. So he's gotten the interim belt before, but then for some reason, he's never really gotten to actually solidify that belt and fight for the actual title. And I think he's long overdue. He's another one of those guys with a super long fight win streak. He finishes a ton of people. And like you said, his style, to me personally, I think he has one of the most exciting styles in the UFC. He's very fluid, very smooth. He transitions every single hit that he has into another movement, right? So he'll throw a punch and then quickly turn that into an elbow, right? Or you shoot in on him, you think you're going to take him down, he turns it into a forward roll, escapes, and then he's back up and throwing some more kicks at you and some more knees. He also goes straight from takedowns right into a submission, right? So he can, take you down and then put you right away into an arm bar or a choke of some kind. And so the fluidity and how smooth he is what I think can be dangerous against Khabib. Not only that, but like I said, Khabib leaves his chin open. A lot of times he sort of leads with his head down when he swings. And I think Tony Ferguson is such a clean and polished striker that he could take advantage of that. And so if there is a guy that can beat Khabib, I really do think it would be Ferguson. And I really hope it happens. I hope it happens by the end of the year. I don't see a whole lot of other people that you could say are next in line other than Ferguson, right? So he's at the top of my list, I believe. So I'd like to see it happen, hopefully by the end of the year even.
Well, we want it to happen by the end of the year, but the UFC does have a lot of fights that they still have to schedule too. Masvidal and Diaz, that got announced, and then you have Manny Nunez still needs to defend her title one more time before the end of the year. So it's gonna get close. We only have 3 months at the end of the year, and the fact that 2019 has flown by this fast is a whole nother story. But it's interesting. So he's made some bold claims. He's a very aggressive fighter in his style too. So like the way he talks about Khabib, that he's lazy, that he's a bit of a wet blanket in the ring. He has to back that up if he wants to break the code, as he says.
Yeah, so, and like I said, I think he can. He's been in some wars before. I think he's only ever lost like one fight in the UFC anyways. He might have lost 1 or 2 before before getting into the UFC. But I think he can definitely back it up. The one thing from the UFC perspective, though, is do you want to put Khabib against Ferguson right now? Especially when Khabib is starting to get a little bit more popular, right? So he dismantled Conor McGregor, and Khabib sort of has all of Russia behind him, which Russia, the thing that's difficult with Russia, and Khabib has even said it before, is that to hold an event there, it would be extremely popular. They love their fighting sports. And literally, Khabib got, a call from Vladimir Putin as soon as he won the belt, right? So that tells you how much this country is into their fighting sports, right? So our big champions, right, when it comes to, let's say, football and basketball, they all get invited to the White House. When it comes to Russia, they get invited after they win some type of fighting championship. So the Russians are always dominant when it comes to wrestling, and they typically always win the world and the Olympics as a team, and a lot of times as individuals. Obviously, they love Sambo, Taekwondo, anything that's fighting, the Russians love. And so if Khabib loses, right, do you somewhat lose a little bit of that whole Russian audience that you get? And the difficult thing, though, is Russia is a little bit poorer, right? So even though they're a big market size-wise, you don't have as many that can buy pay-per-views and stuff like that. But you still have a whole country, right, that supports Khabib right now. Whereas if, Ferguson beats him, now, you sort of lose that sort of country and some of that audience right there. So from the UFC standpoint, I think it's a fun, exciting fight, though it comes with some risk that if Ferguson does beat Khabib, right, you may possibly lose some of that Russian backing and that Russian momentum that you've sort of been building.
The thing about fighting that's always tough is the longer you wait on scheduling these fights, the more you open the door for something bad to happen. Like the way we were talking about DC versus John Jones 3 just being an absolute lock to happen, that fight went out the door because of the Stipe fight. If, let's say, Khabib or Ferguson loses to someone they're not supposed to lose to, then suddenly all the talk of that fight just cools and not anyone's as interested as they would be otherwise. So you always have to capitalize on these fights when they're at their hottest, because they could lose steam very quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And the other thing, too, that you run into is think about like Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao, is when that did happen, it was still a big fight, huge revenue generator. But then it leaves you open for, this fight happened way too late, right? And I think that could be the same thing, especially when it comes to these fighting sports, is the athletes age so quickly. And so even dating back to 2015, you might be able to argue they were younger, right? They're more athletic. I think these guys are still just as good as they were back in 2015. But fans start to say, hey, so-and-so is getting a lot older. This fight should have happened 2, 3, 4 years ago. So I think you're exactly right. I would like to see it happen as soon as possible. The one thing I will say, though, is, and going back to if Khabib possibly loses this fight, is that's why it's so difficult to name a greatest of all time, because as soon as they lose, right, it's like, can you really say that they're the greatest of all time now, right? Anderson Silva for a long time was considered the greatest of all time. He loses to Chris Weidman. Okay, he's no longer really in discussions anymore. And that's why I think you tend to want to go out on top. And so I'm not going to say Khabib's going to avoid this fight, right? By no means. I don't think Khabib is scared at all. But if Khabib wants to stay undefeated, his best chance is fighting other people and accepting other fights outside of Ferguson.
Unfortunately, I do think that would always stain his legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And not to be too prisoner of the moment, but I do truly believe at this point that Khabib is the greatest pound for pound in the sport at this time. I don't know if he's necessarily the biggest ticket draw, but he definitely is the best fighter right now.
Yeah, I think he's definitely underrated as a fighter, which is crazy because he's a champion. But I really do think that he does not get the respect that he deserves. He's one of the best fighters that we've seen. And yes, he uses wrestling, but that's exactly what you're supposed to do in MMA. Why would you try to fight somebody else's style when you risk getting knocked out, or, an arm can get broken, or you can risk major damage to you? So why not fight the fight that is your game plan that you like to do? And I think Khabib's the best at executing his game plan and working to his strengths and not his weaknesses.
I mean, the old saying is, if it ain't broke, why fix it? So.
Exactly.